Welcome back, Senior Devs. Sean Cannon here. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to achieve Zen using these 5 principles: iteration, delegation, deferral, compromise, and appreciation. Starting with iteration. Iterative development is a relatively new concept, but I've found it works really well in an agile environment. The idea with iterative development is that you do the bare minimum necessary to deliver base functionality and then move on. By doing this, you're developing horizontally instead of vertically, and can get a minimum viable product out the door and in the hands of customers much faster. From there, customer feedback can drive the next iteration of development. Do they want more features, or do they want one of the features to be enhanced? Iterative development puts your customers in charge of your product direction, so all your work is meeting a specific customer demand. The contrast of iterative development is waterfall development, where you completely build one thing and then move on to the next thing. It implies the product team already knows exactly what customers want, which is rarely the case. Most of the time, the product teams have ideas they think are great, but ultimately they're created in a biased sandbox, and you won't know if the ideas are good until the product is released to the customers. Let's use a real-world example. Imagine we need to implement authentication into a new product. You have so many options: custom registrations, social logins, SAML, OIDC, and so on. The iterative development mindset would tell us that we should implement the most basic registration possible to get customers into the system. We can add a login with Facebook button and have customers in the database in a couple of hours tops, and then we should move on. I realize not everybody has a Facebook account, but we can plan an initial marketing campaign to use Facebook ads, and then all our prospects will not only have Facebook accounts, but they'll be on Facebook when they click our ad and register with our product quite easily. Our login doesn't need to support signing in with Google or LinkedIn or a custom email and password combo at this point, because no users have asked for it, and we can add those on the next iteration. Instead of spending a full sprint loading up support for the ultimate login page, we spent 2 hours and moved on. Imagine how much we can cover in a sprint with this approach. Of course, all the code we do commit should be fully tested and up to our highest standards. We want it to scale, so we should leverage the strategy pattern and compartmentalize our services so future iterations have an obvious plug-and-play feel to them. Next up, delegation. I used to think that the way to get noticed and promoted was to be the rock star in my team. I thought if I said no when someone asked me to do a task, that someone else would say yes and they would get the promotion. What always ended up happening was I was always working and the managers were always leaving early and enjoying their evenings and weekends. I remember one director on a former project leaving at 5 p.m. one day, while another dev and I stayed literally all night until 8 a.m. the next morning. We were stuck working with an offshore IT department who was refusing to deploy our work in the middle of the night because they never got the okay to deploy it from the director who left. The director came in the next morning at 8 a.m., asked us why we were still there, and explained that since we missed the deadline of deploying our work the night before, we should just plan on deploying it the following month instead. He made us work all night for him and set us up for failure by forgetting to tell the offshore IT team that we'd be needing them. And not only did he never apologize or give us any credit or compliments for pulling an all-nighter, he just blamed us for pushing the deadline back and was actually promoted to a senior director that same month. That was the moment in my career where I realized that working more than everybody else in the room does not get you promoted. It just makes you look overwhelmed and incompetent. The reality is that most tasks don't actually need to get completed when you think they do. Product likes to put a false sense of urgency on tasks, but that's typically only because they made promises to people above them, and they don't want to be put in a situation of explaining why they missed some promised dates. Usually though, the product team promises an entire roadmap made up of smaller promises, and during the sprint planning phase, it's perfectly okay to tell the product team that you're limited for how much work you can accept at the moment. They typically don't care if you could do more. They're often more focused on trying to be accurate with their sprint velocity so their promises won't be broken. It's up to you to underpromise and overdeliver so that they can underpromise and overdeliver. Accept less work during sprint planning so you can complete all your tasks and have time left over to help the other devs and pull some tickets in from the backlog if you run out of work. You will look so much better to everybody around you when you have a really tight to-do list and are being proactive with your time versus having a full to-do list and making people worry and wonder if you're going to be able to finish all the work. The more tasks you own, the less you're able to help out and collaborate. When this happens, you need to take action immediately and ask other devs if they can help you by taking some of your tickets. Asking another dev to help you is actually a really great way to build rapport with that dev. It builds a much deeper rapport than when you help them. It feels a little bit like reverse psychology, but that's just how our brains are wired. To summarize, delegate your work when you feel overwhelmed and learn to say no to people when they want you to stretch yourself too thin. You don't need to downplay your skills or abilities when you refuse the additional work. Instead of saying, "I can't, I'm already overwhelmed," you can simply say, "I'm at sprint capacity and I'm happy to do it next sprint." Keep it brief and professional, and you'll come across as having your shit together. And being reliable and consistent with your sprint velocity is typically much more appreciated by the product team than being able to take on extra tasks to help cover for someone who didn't plan their roadmap well. Remember, doing that favor for them will only affect how you see them, not how they see you. Next on the list, deferral. We covered deferral a bit in the delegation principle, but let's zoom in on this one. Deferral is basically delegation to your future self. During our sprint planning meetings, I'm very conscious about keeping my sprint light, so I punt low priority tickets to future sprints, but keep ownership of them. This does a few things. It keeps me on the client's radar for several weeks or months when they're looking at the roadmap, so when the execs are renewing the SOW, there's no question that I'm a valuable asset to the project. If I locked myself in the office and worked nights and weekends to complete all the tasks that were assigned to me in the backlog, I'd have no more work and they'd roll me off the project. Part of being a good consultant is maintaining a presence on the project to help steer the ship in the right direction when it starts to shift off course. On the surface, it might appear that my value to a project is calculated in Jira story points, but any dev can write code and move those tickets through the swim lanes. I need the clients to see that my value to the project, what makes me irreplaceable, is all the other stuff you're learning in this course. How to see the forest from the trees, how to communicate across teams and translate product objectives to technical objectives, how to help junior devs become senior devs, and so on. You have to believe you are that person before anybody else will believe you're that person. This is all part of the process of taking charge of your software career. You start deciding how many tickets you accept in a sprint instead of letting the product owner or dev manager decide. As long as your tickets are done and you're working on something to help move the team and project forward and upward, you will be perceived as valuable. Nobody will give you a hard time for having no tickets in your queue if you're pairing with other devs, helping them grow and deliver their tickets. One of the most common things I'll try and defer is big underscoped features. The product teams on any number of projects I've worked on over the years love to pitch huge features that don't fit with the existing infrastructure, and they'll add them to the sprint planning out of nowhere. Talking earlier about developing a gut, this is when my gut almost always tells me to stop the feature in its tracks. I'll say something like, "This feels to me like a much bigger feature than was being presented in the ticket. We should kick this out a couple sprints and add a spike to next sprint instead so we can assess all the integration points and see how much extra work will be needed to support this ticket." 15 or even 10 years ago, I'd have just dived right in on a new feature ticket and worried about the integration points after building the feature. Of course, I learned that this is a really messy approach, and when you don't have integration contracts at least identified, let alone spec'd out, you're just asking for a bolt-on solution that will break regularly as the system evolves around it. Next on our list, compromise. Early in my career, I used to be extremely passionate about my way of doing programming. I would resist lateral change because I had convinced myself that my velocity would tank if I switched. When I say lateral change, I mean like switching from 2-space indent to 4-space indent, or from underscore to camel case, or being told to use charting library B when I had been using charting library A on the past 3 projects. None of these changes are better or worse, they're just changes, and so I resisted. The problem, of course, is that while I was extremely comfortable with coding in underscores, another dev on the project was extremely comfortable coding with camel case. To this dev, I came off as a stubborn asshole. The manager at the time sided with the other dev, and we went with camel case. It didn't take me long at all to get used to it, and I've stuck with it ever since. Any one of these lateral comparables I've used on at least one project in my career, and I have been forced to switch so many times I can stand here and assure you now that none of these preferences are worth standing your ground. You can certainly vote for them if you're starting a new project, but I highly recommend you save your battles for things that matter. Object-oriented versus functional patterns, for example. That's a big deal because you don't want to have to deal with mutation if you don't have to. So where OOP may work really well for a video game, it introduces a lot of unnecessary complexity and overhead on a web app, for example. By showing your team that you're willing to let go of your preferences to them, they'll most likely reciprocate that when you do insist on something you're passionate about. One strategy I've used in the past on a team is when we had a meeting to redefine our coding standards. We had, say, 20 items on the agenda to cover, similar to the few I mentioned above. Each dev in the meeting got 20 votes. They could vote on any item with as many votes as they had in their hand. If the item in question wins in their favor, they lose those votes for any future items. It makes it really fair and democratic. For example, if I participated in this approach in the future, I'd save all my votes for the JavaScript library Ramda, because it's helped me improve my JavaScript project so drastically, I can't even comprehend working on a project without it, or some alternative functional programming library like Sanctuary or Lodash-FP. Start letting go of little biases and just let the linter do its thing. Set up your IDE so that when you hit the tab key, it adds however many indentation spaces the team decides on, and your workflow doesn't really change that much at all. It actually gives you an opportunity to expand and grow every time you don't get your way, so take it with a grain of salt and compromise whenever possible. People will like working with you much more when you make it clear to them that their opinions matter and your working relationship with them is much more important to you than some syntax that helps you type faster. The last principle I want to cover to help you achieve Zen in your workday is learning to appreciate work-life balance. We've already covered delegation and deferral to help you free your workload, but taking this a step further, you need to be able to clock out at the end of your day. If you're passionate about coding and software development, this doesn't mean you need to unplug necessarily. You should at some point every day, but really I'm talking about setting a hard boundary of when you stop helping your employer live their life and start living your own. Your workday is your client's dream. They dreamed of getting to the point of owning a business and hiring staff to build it for them. You're realizing that dream for them from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, week after week, or whatever your current schedule is. If you already work for yourself and you have paying clients, then set your workday boundaries in your SOW when you sign your paperwork. In order to be able to give your 100% to any project, you need to be able to recharge and spend time away from the project. I personally wake up every morning around 5:30 to 6:30 a.m. and get 60 to 90 minutes to myself to work on whatever side project I've assigned myself. Like this course, for example, writing hundreds of pages of scripts or recording videos just like this one. At 7:45 a.m., I'll let my dogs out and have a quick breakfast, and work from 8 to 5, taking a lunch break at noon to hang out with my wife and kids. I relax for a half hour after work, and then work out either by going to jiu-jitsu for 2 hours or by working out in my garage and running around the neighborhood. I'll have dinner around 8 p.m. and hang out with my family again, watching some TV or doing whatever they want to do. On the weekends, I have more jiu-jitsu, and then I rarely touch my computer unless my family has their own plans, and then I'll just tinker on some Arduino projects or something fun, maybe play some video games or read. Come Monday, I've had a full 2 days to recharge and I'm ready to give 100% again. Imagine had I been working on my full-time project all weekend, how much I would dread Monday. I'd feel like I'd never get a break, like I'm overworked or burning out. Burnout is a very real thing. You need to take your breaks. Again, you don't need to break from your passion. You need a break from your employer's passion. If you're a full-time dev building your own stuff and doing client work and you just love doing what you do, by all means, keep doing your thing, friend. Just don't neglect other people in your life or you're likely gonna lose what you love the most. When my first son was born, my instincts kicked in to be a provider, but I was young and the only way I knew how to provide was to earn money writing software. So I'd work and work and work. I was in my office for 12 to 14 hours every day just coding my life away trying to earn as much money as possible so my wife wouldn't have to work. My wife started resenting me for working all the time, and I started resenting her for not appreciating how hard I was working for her and our son. We just weren't seeing eye to eye at all. Thankfully, she was able to help me understand that I was missing out on precious early moments with my son, and she was feeling alone and overwhelmed having to take care of him all day by herself. We ultimately decided on a work schedule that made us both feel happier, and our stress levels went way down, and our relationship has been stronger ever since. It was that moment when I realized the importance of work-life balance. I promised myself if I ever have to work an all-nighter again, I'm taking the next 2 days off to make up for it. Balance is everything, my friends. That wraps up this module. Keep growing, and I'll see you in the next one.